Here is a blue ink by Sailor Manyo Nekoyanagi. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook. A huge shame that isn't seen in doing these reviews is an ink that is a real letdown, cost just as much in time and money to make a review of as a great ink. So hopefully this review will save you some money. The pen for today is a Levenger True Writer. All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the extra fine nib, man oh man, is this a light one. I did a whole bunch of scribbling in the upper left corner to see just how dark I could make it through tons and tons and tons of scribbling. Now there's no feathering and there is no spread, and it's also incredibly hard to see. Luckily, there is a little bit of shading, like if you look at heart, the first word, which is a little bit darker at the H and lightens up. Now, bore down on is much harder to read, and I'm not even sure how well, until I'm editing this, it comes through on camera. I'm just really hoping it does. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine, thankfully, but not dark enough to really be helpful. There is no feathering and there is no spread. There is some shading that you can see if you look at slipping, first word on the second line, at the loop of the G where I accidentally closed it up, it did get darker. Also on the second line, the starts lighter and does get darker into the he. Thankfully, it's got areas that get darker. Oh God, this is rough. It was a hard day of writing with it. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the medium, thankfully, and it's actually kind of readable. There is no feathering and there is no spread. There is shading. You could see it when you look at could on the first line. That starts darker on the CO, but the U lightens up and darkens up again into the LD. More the point to me on this is, in general, with it being more of the darker tones, it at least becomes usable. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting, to no surprise of this very, very light ink. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here's the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, thank goodness, but about as dark as the medium was on the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering and there is no spread. There is little bits of shading, like the D of pulled on the third line, or the H and M of him right next to it. For the most part, it's fairly light and unusable. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine, tiny bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. I was really hoping the more absorbent papers were going to save this ink, and I just, no, and I'm going to tell you, I cut the other writing samples out because it really doesn't get any better, and yeah. Looking at the stub nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the medium, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get some shading. Take a look at the bank on the first line, where the is the darkest word on the page, really, and bank just works its way from a midtone lighter into the middle and back into the midtone on the K. I really do find this one of the darker tones we get with it, and still not a tone that I'm really very happy with. Looking at the back of the page, to no great surprise, there's no bleeding, no ghosting, because we could barely see it on the front of the page.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left. Pen flush is on the top right. 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Birmingham Pen Company, Andrew Carnegie Steel Blue. Here is Blackstone Sydney Harbor Blue. Here is Califolio Blue Atlantique. Here is Colorverse Cat. While it's nice to see inks in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements this color on the page. Here is a pink ink by Pilot 100th Anniversary Pink. Here is an orange ink by Robert Oster Tangerine. Here is a magenta ink by Diamine Syra. Here is a yellow ink by Noodler's Golden Brown. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, I can't help but wonder if having done so many ink reviews has me a bit bitter about some of these inks that really don't do well, but at least here it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Maybe readable. I would be fairly bothered as a teacher if a student was using this on their paper, with it being as light as it is, but at least on the 20-pound copy paper, you can read it. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Yes, I'm sure there's feathering and I'm sure there's spread, and I just can't really see it because it's a very light color. Still much easier to read than it was on the premium paper. So if you have this, you could always use it up on the 20-pound paper where at least you can see it. Looking at the stub nib, it is the darkest tone on the page, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is feathering, there is some spread. It's actually dark enough in some areas. You can see the tiny little bit, but here, again, it's not any kind of a real issue. I am going to say to hold out to see it on the yellow paper, because I think the yellow Rhodia at the very end, it probably looks its best. Looking at the back of the page, hey, this is a winning thing for it. There's no bleeding and no ghosting. You could totally write on the back of this paper with this ink, though why would you want to?
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The only really usable writing came from the wet broad that you're seeing now, and the yellow Rhodia that it's on really did help it. Now, you can tell by how short the video is that I am really wanting to be done with this ink in a review. It was a nightmare to write with for a day, so thankfully I'll never return to it.
I hope you got something out of this video, and I want to remind you that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you've heard of something if you were to go to buy.